everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for another installment of Stories from the Railway. And today we're pleased, or actually very excited, maybe because we're girls, but we've got lots of them here too, that we're going to be focusing on love today. And it's a little bit of a softer side of the railway. I know some of you have joined us for some previous stories from the railway and have heard stories of railroading from the 50s through the 80s. As well as architecture of the railway, and we're just really pleased to be able to bring stories of the people and sort of the love of the railway. And we at the museum, to coin the term of our former president, really like to focus on the human element of the railway because it's really everyone's stories that make history. So thank you very much for joining us. Just a few quick things here. Washrooms, I'm sure most of you know where they are now, but if not, you can head through the double doors and they're just past the elevator on the left-hand side. We're also videotaping today, and thank you very much to the Workers' Heritage Museum and Barry for coming out and doing that for us. But not to worry, just pretty much your heads will be part of that. After our first speaker, we'll invite everyone to come back up to the main lobby, and we'll have some light refreshments, some coffee, tea, and some cookies, little snacks. So please help yourself. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Maureen Halpenny, who was born and raised in Smiths Falls. She's the daughter of a former railway CPR railway engineer, Harold Halpenny, and Maureen I first met when we started doing the history project and collecting oral histories, and we just haven't let her go yet. So, without further ado, Maureen Halpenny.
Good afternoon. I hope I don't bore you too much because it's been going through family memories and the theme falling in love with the railway. I'm honored to speak because during the last couple of months I reconnected with my parents and my siblings, and we're sharing stories. Oh, do you remember the time that? And how was that? So I hope I don't ramble too much. But I want to say before I even start, as a way of disclaimer, these are my memories and my experiences. Other children who were raised on the railroad, as we like to say, might have different recollections and different memories, although we do share some commonality. This is my truth. When I would be visiting over at Willowdale, oftentimes I would run into railroaders, that's where my parents are now, and children of railroaders. And I was talking to one, Lynn Muskelly, her dad, Red, used to work with my dad on the railroad, and I told her what I was doing, and she said, oh, for sure. She said, railroaders' brats, yeah. I said, yeah. And she said, guess what I got for Christmas? And I said, what? She said, I got a skill saw for Christmas. But I understood, because being a railroad kid, your parents taught you to do everything. You knew how to do basic carpentry, wiring, plumbing, male or female, it didn't matter, because you had to be self-reliant and responsible. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But one thing I wanted to start with, I suppose to be a railroader, I should have the railroader's cap. 90% of the time I saw my dad, he had this hat on. And then, of course, there was the railroader kerchief. I don't know whether it has another name, but I just called it a railroader's kerchief. So we get into the jargon even as kids before we start. The railroader's hat, railroader's kerchief. Then we had railroader's flashlight, heavy-duty little thing with CPR right on it, and Dad would bring it home and say, don't get caught with that. That's CPR. The railroader lunch pail that was still in the basement. I'll be talking about that a little bit more later. How many of you in this room either were a railroader or related to railroaders? Yep, that's Smiths Falls. Here we are. So you've probably heard this expression, railroader's turkey. Anybody know what railroader's turkey is? Bologna. Bologna. What are we having for lunch? Railroader's turkey. Oh, just stringy old bologna. Railroader's potatoes. Now they call them hash browns or refried potatoes, but it was railroaders' thing. And I thought that military time was a long time before I grew up and knew that military time, 0800, was military time. I thought it was railroaders' time. Because you had to know what that was too. To start off, when we talk about love in the railroad, there were many kinds of love. This picture was done for my dad on his retirement by another railroader. This is probably one of his prized possessions. It was done by Owen Pepper, railroader in town. It represents the train, the Royal Hudson, actually this is, because Dad started on the steam train, then the diesel that he went on. This represents my dad, and they all had nicknames, so this would be Hal. But the bond that was between railroader brothers was probably where it all started. Even before they were married, they were like family. So Dad was on the railroad from 46 to 81. And Owen gave him this at the retirement party. And it is, as I said, one of his prized possessions. So that was one kind of love amongst the men who took care of themselves and each other, sharing things. That extended to their families. The wives would know each other. The kids would know each other. We'd hang out together. So that's the first kind of love. First slide. Doing this research, I discovered that I'm probably 4 or 5 generations railroader. These were the people that raised my mom. They were an aunt at the top, Carrie Hutchison, Rob Hutchison at the bottom. Shortly after my mom was born, her mother died, and then her aunt, Carrie, and Bob, Daddy Bob she always called him, raised her. Carrie's father, Albert Johnston, he apparently worked on the CPR going out west. That would be at the turn of the century. Daddy Bob at the bottom, he joined the railroad in 1917. They were married in 1920, and through the years, the connections were, okay, Daddy Bob was a railroader. Hutchie was her nickname. Her first grandchild couldn't say Hutchison, so nicknamed her Hutchie, and everybody on the planet called her that since then. So when I refer to Hutchie, I'm talking about the woman at the top. Her father, her brother-in-law, she had 2 nephews, her son-in-law, a great-grandson and a grandson, all worked on the railroad that I know of. So it started off with a lovely marriage and growing a family, and then tragedy. Daddy Bob was killed. My mom was 9. Her adopted brother and sister, well, the girl was 19, the son was about 15, so he was still in high school. My mom was about 9 and 10. And this changed everything. For this death, she received a pension of $40 a month. And in 1940, $40 a month didn't go very far. When I was checking with my mom this morning to see whether it was $40 a year or $40 a month, she said a month, but she said she had to have special shoes and they cost $40. So there went. So what do when the love of your life is taken from you on the railroad and you are left to support, well, 2 still living at home, 2 kids? What do? Well, you have to work. My grandmother, Hutchie, this is the silk mill, which is on Victoria Street, across from the old railway station. This was in the 1940s. There she is there, Hutchie. And she worked in the silk mill. And they made, well, I think during the war they made parachutes, but they also made underwear and things like that. And my mother said when she was a youngster, she got a job in the silk mill too, working on weekends and after school, sewing buttons on bloomers. because there were no zippers or anything then. But that would hardly be enough to support a growing family. So, my grandmother, living on 17 Smiths Falls Avenue in Smiths Falls, she took in 13 boarders. Wow. 12 of which were railroaders. And so, for $5 to $10 a week, she would provide room, board, 3 full meals a day, and pack a pail when necessary. So that was one start. It became sort of a superstition that railroaders would not take a call or be ordered from that house, because besides my grandfather who was killed being ordered from that house, 4 others over time were killed on the railroad going out of that house. But that still wasn't enough money. My grandmother, every Saturday, would get up at 3 a.m. and make donuts. By hand, of course, working over a coal oil stove. Hey, I said it without stumbling. 1 pot with old grease. You could only cook about 2 or 3 at a time. So on a weekend, she'd make 50 dozen donuts and sell them within the town. She'd take orders for them. And my mom would deliver them for 1 cent a dozen on her bicycle. So it was a family project. Later on, my grandmother became a switchboard operator at Bell Canada in Smiths Falls on William Street. Now, some of you will remember the old phone. No dial-up, right? You would lift this, and my grandmother would come on the phone and say, "Number, please." And then you would tell the phone number that you wanted, and she'd connect you with a big cord, plug it into the switchboard. And a lot of her calls, of course, would be coming from the CPR office of men being ordered. And they used to ask my grandmother, who had an understanding of the railroad, whatever you do, don't disconnect. Keep that phone ringing until I answer. Because if the man missed the call, that was pretty bad then. It would affect your pay and your income. So she would be to the point where she'd let it ring forever, and then if the person still didn't answer, she would oftentimes phone the number of a call boy or a call girl who would go to the house and wake the person up so that they didn't miss a call. So that was back in the day where privacy really didn't exist on the phone, but in Smiths Falls everybody knew everybody, so it's no big deal anyway. She moved later to Kent Street in Smiths Falls. Some of you will remember it as Crates Row, Main Street, whatever, over in that section by the railroad. Next. My parents were married in 1950. My dad had been in the war, and when he came back from the war, he was looking for a job. He tried to get on at the mines, but that didn't work out too well. So he got on the railroad in, I believe, 1946. So this is my dad, my mom, and then aunts and uncles on the end. He worked his way up, starting in the freight shed, unloading boxcars, and then he became a fireman, shoveling the coal in the old steam locomotives. And at that time, a lot of people don't realize that to make this move from unloading boxcars to firing an engine, you had to write exams. There were books that you had to study, of rules that you had to follow, and you were monitored very closely. But anyway, when they got married, or before they got married, in comes the whistle. The train whistle is very important in our family tradition. I guess Dad, when he was working on the road, doing in the yard, that would be the local trains moving boxcars and that, the engineer was a Mr. Catchpole, and he would say to my dad, "Oh, there goes that girl again," because she'd be walking by the yard. So my mother, "You better blow the whistle." So Dad would blow the whistle at Mom, and of course she would just walk and not notice. But the whistle became very important in our family because Dad, being away from home so often, as all railroaders are, he would say to us kids, "Now when you hear the whistle, I'm saying hi. So even to this day, when I hear a whistle, I feel good about a train whistle. He boarded at another railroader's place before Mom and he were married. And then in 1951, he was what they call set up as an engineer. So he started working with a little bit more money, driving the train, rather than just shoveling the coal. Shoveling the coal, when I was talking to the kids, I realized a lot of them haven't even seen coal. It was coal. And my dad, one way to Montreal, shoveled 8 tons. 8 tons. I thought, when I heard that, I thought, how come he wasn't muscular like Arnold Schwarzenegger? Skinny, lean guy, but 8 tons of coal. One way. Next one. To make this beast go. Now, when you're doing that, you got a big responsibility. You see this smoke coming out of there? It better be the right color. Because the women that lived near the railroad that did their laundry, if that was black smoke coming out of there, the laundry had to come off the line. And we're not talking automatic washers, we're talking old ringer washers. And they had to do it all again. And then you can bet they'd be on the phone to the yard office saying, who's that fool that's dirtying all my laundry? So the smoke had to be white color. And you can see it's a big, forceful machine.
Control the air.
That's right. So they weren't really worried too much about the environment. They were worried about the housewives.
Smart man.
Okay, next. This was my family living on Kent Street. Typical 50s family. I was born in 51. Uh-oh, it said how old I was. So that's me in the center. Then my brother, he was about 3 or 4, and then my sister, about 3, and then the youngest, about 1. So this is a typical railroader family. They had big families back then. And having 4 kids, even though I have heard that railroaders made good money, I always thought we were poor because we had to fight to make ends meet. Nothing was taken for granted. You're not talking being into organized sports and paying the fees for that. No. You would skate if you had an aunt or an uncle who would donate you skates or give you skates. And what you got to eat was, well, my mother was a genius. I don't know how she did it. What a team they made, Mom and Dad. So that was us in the beginning. Next one. And these are pictures from Kent Street. So we were at number 4. My grandmother was down here, which was kind of neat to have her so close. And she even had boarders, I can remember, when I was in public school. She was still doing it to survive. So you can see my dad, my 2 sisters, the dog Bingo. The railroad came into everything. Dad always promised us a dog, and he brought Bingo in 1960 back from Montreal in his pocket. So we were always anxious to see Dad come back on the road. You never knew what he was going to have, but that's where Bingo came from. And the name Bingo, because Mom made the money at the bingo. The wives didn't have a lot of activities. As you can imagine, taking care of 4 kids, you didn't get out much. But bingo was one thing that she did. So that supplemented the income. I remember we got the dog from the bingo games. And then I remember twin beds. Mother won another time at the bingo, a jackpot, so we got twin beds. So this was Kent Street. On Kent Street. How many of you know where that is? Okay. Within that radius, when I was growing up, I counted, there were 27 railroader families. Just on that street and the street behind and across the way. So one of the things you had to do as a child, you better not make noise when railroaders are sleeping. With 27 of them living on the street, what chance did you have? You had to play quietly regardless what it was, what you were doing. And whichever end of the street you would play on depended depended on who was on call, who'd book rest, who was sleeping. Mom said even years later that one of the best compliments she ever got was from the man that lived next door, Cap Fagan, when we were there, who said, "You really have good kids. They know enough to be quiet when railroaders are sleeping." And Mother thought that was amazing. But with 27 in the area, it was like a big family in many ways. The husbands knew and understood what was going on. The wives knew and understood, and the kids as well. So we would help each other. That was good sometimes and bad sometimes. There was what I refer to as a jungle telegraph. You did anything wrong, they knew who you were and they knew where you lived. I remember one time I was 6 years old, I'd gotten a bicycle and I wasn't supposed to ride it across town. Before I got home, my mother knew. And I was grounded from the telephone pole on the corner here to my grandmother's house for a month, and just on this side of the street, mind you. So you always knew that you would be safe if you were in trouble. You could go to another railroader's house, another family, and help each other, and the wives tried to help each other as well, because it was tough working on the railroad. Dad, although Mom says he never complained about his job in 35 years, except when he had to miss Christmas, which was difficult, and Christmas never started until Dad got home. For the men, it was very lonely. They were away from their wives. Some men, they would come home and they'd hardly recognize their children because they didn't know who they were. They missed a lot of that formative thing, so it was hard on them. Dad always said, "You're not to date a railroader or marry one, and my brother's not to be one because it's too hard on the family, even with all the good things." For the wives, sometimes I feel, being a former history teacher, and you're doing research on soldiers away at war and things like that, and you check into their lives, the forgotten ones are the wives. The women were at home, in the case of railroaders, raising 4 kids on their own, and there was a period of over 8.5 years when my dad was working in the yards in Montreal, where he came home once a week. I saw my dad a day and a half in an 8.5-year period, a day and a half a week. Can you imagine what that's like? You were a single mom, really. You had to do everything. And as I get older and talk to other people, I realize that this created a lot of families that had problems. A lot of the women couldn't take it or suffered from nervous conditions. Some went to addictions. And the kids, of course, would suffer, and the husbands would suffer, and the wives, bless their hearts, I still don't know how they did it. So you would band together. Every Saturday, for as long as I can remember, myself and everybody on the street went to the Soper Theater downtown. It didn't matter what was showing, but all those kids were gone. That was family time, I guess. Now I understand a little bit. I said to somebody, "I saw Peyton Place at age 10 years old. What's that all about?" The theater was just the hub for all these railroader kids, and there were 100 of us running the aisles, and they had ushers and matrons who would follow you and make sure that you were being good. But you daren't come home until the show was over. And for 25 cents, it was cheaper than a babysitter, because for a quarter you could get 2 shows, cartoons, popcorn, and a pop. For 25 cents, cheaper than a babysitter. So there we be. Now, what else did we do for fun? Like I said, I don't remember having a lot of money. So we had the dreadful Sunday drive. Does anybody remember the Sunday drive? Lord, a lot of the wives didn't drive. This was a sort of a gender thing. So when Dad was home, we had to have the Sunday drive. I used to get car sick.